Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about what's happening in the Russian economy, and specifically to talk about the export of fossil fuels. Now, historically, the export of fossil fuels was the heartbeat of the Russian economy. That's what Russia has built its wealth upon, selling excess oil and gas and coal and other commodities to all of the countries that want to buy it. But obviously, as a result of the sanctions that have been applied over the last 2.5 years, a lot of countries have turned their back on Russia and said they don't want to buy those products, even if they're the cheapest in the market. And that's had a massive impact on Russia's income. Prior to the invasion, Russia was earning around $1 billion per day from the sale of its fossil fuels. And even though you may have read in the press that Russia is now doing better than ever, it's selling huge volumes to China and India to offset all of the lost sales from the West, the situation is actually that total revenue is down by around 40%. So Russia is losing hundreds of millions of dollars per day, and on an annual basis, that adds up to around $125 billion. And actually, the situation is worse than that, because immediately following the invasion, Russia's income spiked, and when you compare the lost income to that period, it's down by more than $250 billion. So in today's video, we'll go through some of the details. We'll have a look at what's happened to the income that Russia is earning from oil, refined products, liquefied natural gas, pipeline gas and coal. We'll also have a look at what's happened to the volume of products that Russia is selling, because it's now selling a similar volume to what it was historically, but because the prices are lower, total revenue is down. We'll also have a look at what's going on with shipping, because prior to the invasion, the world of shipping was completely dominated by the West. Because the European countries tended to be the seafaring nations historically, they're the ones that control most of the inventory and the insurance world for shipping. And at the start of the war, Russia was entirely dependent on those ships, but it's been trying to move away from that dependency. So we'll have a look at what's happened in terms of Russia's use of ships from the West and how it's now using its dark tanker fleet. And if you follow the channel, you'll know that I recently posted a video talking about the fact that the West is now closing in on that dark tanker fleet. They're going to intercept any ships that are moving through their waters, and that could have a huge negative impact on Russia. And then finally today, I'll wrap up with my summary as to what I think has happened over the past 2.5 years with regards to fossil fuel sales, what's happening right now, and what the potential impact on the Russian economy will be over the course of the next 6 to 12 months. But before we get into all of that, I'd like to say once again, thank you so much to everyone that's supporting the channel. If you watch my videos, well, thank you for that. It does help with the views. If you're a subscriber, that's fantastic. Helps me build that subscriber count. I'm trying to get up to 500,000. It's a long way off in the distance. So if you haven't subscribed yet and you do watch my videos, please click on that button. Thank you to everyone that's supporting the channel on a long-term basis, either through Patreon, where you can watch my videos early and advert-free, or YouTube membership, where you'll also get early access, or buy me a coffee membership. Really appreciate that support. And if you've bought me a coffee or sent me a YouTube super thanks recently, thank you for the time and the effort and the generosity involved in that. Really does mean a lot to me. This chart shows the daily value of Russian fossil fuel exports from the 1st of January 2022, which was the month before the war in Ukraine started, through to the end of July 2024. The scale on the left-hand side of this chart is shown in millions of euros, and just as a point of reference, €1 equates to roughly 1.1 US dollars. And we've got 5 different categories of fossil fuel shown here. The bottom section relates to the income from crude oil, so that's oil that's just being pulled out of the ground and is then shipped in its original form. The section above that relates to refined oil products, so crude oil that's been through the refinery process and has been broken down into higher value products such as gasoline, diesel and kerosene. The section above that relates to pipeline gas, so this is natural gas that Russia is sending via pipelines. Historically, a lot of that gas was going to Europe, but Russia also has pipelines in place with China. The blue section relates to coal exports, and the section at the top relates to liquefied natural gas, so natural gas that's been converted into a liquid that Russia is exporting via ships. Now, if we start off by looking at the situation in January 2022, which was before any of the sanctions were put in place against Russia. Really interestingly, at that time, the biggest single earner for Russia in terms of fossil fuel exports was pipeline gas, which was generating daily revenue for Russia of €285 million, which on an annualised basis equated to €104 billion, or around $115 billion. The second largest revenue stream was from crude oil sales, which were generating €250 million of revenue per day, which on an annualised basis was €91 billion, or around $100 billion. The third largest revenue stream came from refined oil products, which were generating €232 million per day, which equates to €85 billion, or around $94 billion. The fourth largest revenue stream was liquefied natural gas, which was generating €88 million of revenue per day, which equates to an annual revenue of €32 billion, or $35 billion. And coal was generating €54 million per day, which is an annual income of €20 billion, or around $22 billion. So the overall summary at the start of 2022 was that Russia was earning around €910 million per day, so the equivalent of $1 billion every single day from the export of its fossil fuels. Now, as we've discussed many times before, the immediate impact of Russia's invasion of Ukraine was that the price of all fossil fuels spiked. There was concern all across the world about what was going to happen with Russia's global supply of oil and gas and coal. And as a result of that, prices rose. And you can see that Russia's total revenue actually increased in the initial period following the invasion. And in April 2022, Russia's total revenue from fossil fuel exports actually increased to $1.4 billion. So that was an increase of 40% against what Russia was earning at the start of January. And the two categories that saw the largest increase were oil exports, which rose to €400 million per day, which was an increase of around 60%, and pipeline gas exports increased to €350 million per day, which represented an increase of around 23%. However, as you can see from the chart, over the course of the past 2 years, as the sanctions have kicked in against Russian fossil fuel exports, Russia's total earnings have fallen, and the latest figures for July 2024 show that Russia's single biggest export earner now is oil, which is bringing in around €250 million per day, which is exactly the same as Russia was earning before the war started. Russia's second largest earner is now refined oil products, which are bringing in around €200 million per day, which represents a fall of around 14%. Compared with what Russia was earning in January 2022. Interestingly, Russia's third largest earner today is coal, which is bringing in around €70 million per day, which represents an increase of around 30% against what Russia was earning in January 2022. However, in terms of the loss of income that Russia has encountered, the single biggest impact has been on gas sales. Russia's revenue from pipeline gas exports has fallen from €285 million before the war started to €60 million per day today, representing a fall of 80%. And liquefied natural gas sales are also down from around €88 million to €20 million, which represents a fall of around 77%. And the net impact of all of this is that Russia's total income from fossil sales is now down to around $660 million per day, compared to $1 billion before the war started, which represents a fall of $340 million per day, which on an annualised basis is $124 billion. However, compared to the peak period when Russia was earning the maximum amount from its fossil fuel sales, the daily revenue is down by $740 million, which equates to $270 billion. So this really puts into perspective the impact of the war in Ukraine on Russia's income. So as we've just discussed, since the start of the war in Ukraine, Russia has lost income equating to more than $124 billion per year. And in fact, compared with the peak period, it's down by almost $270 billion. But one thing that's really interesting to look at is the volume of fossil fuels that Russia is exporting. And you can see from this chart, which is exactly the same data that we've just looked at, but changing the metric from millions of euros to thousands of tons, that the total volume of fossil fuels that Russia is exporting is actually very similar to what it was at the start of 2022. So if we start off by looking at crude oil, which is the section at the bottom of this chart, as we've just discussed, in January 2022, Russia was earning around 250 million euros per day. Today, it's earning a similar amount, and you can see that over the past 2.5 years, the volume of crude oil has actually remained relatively constant. If we now have a look at the situation for refined products, in January 22, Russia was exporting 388 million tonnes of refined oil products per day. Today, it's exporting 297. So the volume has gone down. However, the income that Russia is earning has gone down considerably, from 232 million euros per day to 200, which represents an annual fall of around $11 billion. Now, the situation for pipeline gas is really quite interesting because, as we've just discussed, the income that Russia is earning from pipeline gas has fallen by around 80% as a result of the sanctions that have been put in place against Russia. However, the volume of gas that Russia is exporting has fallen from 322 million tonnes per day to around 150, which represents a fall of around 50% compared with a fall in income of 80%. So the gas that Russia is still selling through its pipelines today is being sold at a lower price than it was prior to the war in Ukraine. And the main recipient of that gas now is China, which historically have negotiated very hard with Russia in terms of the price that it's prepared to pay. The situation for coal is slightly different. Prior to the war in Ukraine, Russia was exporting 422 million tonnes of coal per day. However, today it's exporting 450. So the volume has gone up, and that equates to the increase in revenue that Russia has seen over the same period. And with regards to liquefied natural gas, in January 2022, Russia was exporting 109 million tonnes per day. Today, it's exporting around 51, which means that the volume has halved as a result of the fact, partly of the loss of customers as a result of the sanctions being applied against Russia, and also the operational problems that Russia has encountered as a result of its loss of partnerships with companies from the West. This chart shows a breakdown of the main buyers of Russian crude oil from January 2022 through to July 2024. And the scale on the left-hand side of this chart is shown in millions of euros. And the reason I wanted to look at these details is firstly to look at the change in terms of the consumers that Russia is dealing with, but also to look at what's going on with regards to total revenue from crude oil sales. At the start of January 2022, 69% of all of Russia's crude oil sales were going directly to countries from the West. And at that point in time, China represented 27% of Russia's total sales, and India were not buying any crude oil at all from Russia. Now, as you can see, in the initial 12-month period following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the amount of crude oil being bought by the West reduced dramatically as a result of the sanctions. It didn't reduce to zero overnight because for a lot of the European countries, they were struggling to be able to find alternative sources of crude oil. When you're talking about moving millions of barrels of oil per day, it takes a while to get the logistics in place to be able to find alternative suppliers. But as you can see, over the past 2 years, there's been a significant shift in terms of the buying pattern, and the biggest single change has been a huge increase in the purchases by India. That's shown by the brown section in the middle, and those purchases have partly offset the purchases that were previously being made by the West. However, as you can see on the right-hand side of this chart, over the past few months, the level of purchases from India has actually started to reduce, and this is as a result of the risk of secondary sanctions. Over the past 6 months or so, the USA and Europe have really started to clamp down on any companies that are found to be dealing with Russian companies that are under sanctions. And if those companies are proven to be dealing with the Russian entities, then they face the risk of exactly the same sanctions that are being applied against Russia. And from India and China's point of view, that represents a big problem because the vast majority of their global trade is not with Russia. Russia represents a small percentage of exports for China and India. And so because those companies are worried about the risk of secondary sanctions, there has now been a reduction in the amount of purchases from India and China. And if we look at the total revenue that Russia was earning at the end of July, you can see that it's broadly similar to the revenue that it was earning back in January 2022. But the breakdown today is really quite interesting. China currently represents around 25% of all of the purchases. So a similar figure to where it was before the war in Ukraine started. So there hasn't been a material increase in the level of purchasing from China. India has significantly increased its purchases, and today it's Russia's single largest customer, representing around 38% of all of the crude oil that's purchased. However, that figure has come down from more than 50% that was seen earlier in 2024. Turkey is Russia's third largest customer, representing around 11%. But I think what's really interesting here is that 25% of Russia's total recorded revenue right now is coming from unknown sales. So this is basically where Russia is sending oil to unknown destinations using its dark shipping fleet. And this is an area that the West is now targeting, trying to cut out all of those dark tankers, trying to intercept them to cut back on Russia's income. This chart shows the geographical breakdown of sales for refined oil products from Russia. And I think the first thing to note here is, as we've just discussed, compared with the situation back in January 2022, Russia's total revenue from refined oil sales has fallen significantly. And one of the reasons for that is that refined oil products are sold at a higher price. They're an added value product. And so countries such as India and China are reluctant to buy those finished products because they have their own refining industries. They would prefer to buy crude oil and put it through their own refinery, generate employment and income in their own countries, and also be in a position to be able to sell on those refined oil products to other countries if they want to. If we look at the situation back in January 2022, 85% of all of the refined oil products were being sold to the West. That's shown by the grey section. Now, over the course of the past 2.5 years, there has been a significant reduction in the amount of refined oil products that the West is buying. However, they still represent around 25% of all of Russia's refined oil product sales. And the main reason for that is that for some countries in Europe that are landlocked and therefore have to get their oil via pipelines, it's difficult to be able to find replacement suppliers. So there's still an element of Europe that's buying refined products directly from Russia. Russia's second largest customer for refined products is Turkey, which represents around 16% of sales, followed by Brazil, which represents around 12%, and India and China both represent around 6%. And once again here we've got a growing element of sales that are in the unknown category, so they're being provided by the dark tanker fleet, and this is an area that the West is now looking to clamp down upon. Picking up on that issue of the dark tanker fleet, the old and decrepit tankers that Russia is using to transport some of its oil, these two charts show the percentage of crude oil and refined products that are transported using ships that are either owned or insured by the West. If we start off by looking at the data for crude oil, the light blue section at the bottom shows those ships owned and insured by the European Union and the G7. The blue section across the middle of the chart shows those ships insured by Norway, and the grey section at the top represents ships owned and insured by the rest of the world. So if we start off by looking at the situation prior to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, at that point, 60% of all of the ships that Russia was using were either owned or insured by the European Union and the G7, and a further 13% were insured by Norway. So 73%, almost 3/4 of all of the ships that Russia were using were owned or insured by the West. Now, as you can see, over the course of the last 2.5 years, there's been a significant reduction. And the situation at the end of July 2024 is that Russia is now using only 16% of those ships to transport its crude oil. So 84% of all of the shipments are going through other methods. And this is an issue from Russia's point of view because the maritime industry is dominated by countries from the West. Historically, the European countries were the seafaring nations, and the shipping industry is still entirely dependent on those countries. So the 84% of ships that Russia is now using to transport all of its crude oil, a lot of those ships are actually the dark tanker fleet. So these are tankers that are old, Some of them have limited insurance, and a lot of them turn their transponders off, so they're difficult to track. And this is the area that the West is now trying to clamp down upon. And of course, the reason why Russia has significantly reduced its usage of ships from the West is because those ships are applying the price cap. Under the terms of the price cap, any ship that transports Russian oil has to prove that that deal was done at less than $60 per barrel. And of course, Russia doesn't want to sell its oil at $60 per barrel. It wants to sell it for 70 or 80. And so the more ships that Russia can use that are not owned or insured by the West, the more it can circumnavigate the sanctions. If we now look at the same statistics for refined oil products, you can see that back in January 2022, the situation was broadly similar. 76% of all refined products were transported using ships owned or insured by the EU and the G7, and a further 10% were provided by Norway. So a total of 86% of all of Russia's oil was going on ships that were owned or insured by the West. Now, over the course of the past 2.5 years, there has also been a reduction in the usage of ships from the West. However, it has been significantly lower than the percentage that we just saw for crude oil. And in July 2024, the total percentage of ships owned or insured by the West that Russia is using for the movement of its refined oil products is 61%, so still around 2/3. And the reason for that is that these are much higher value products, and so Russia is prepared to accept the price cap, which has been set at $100 per barrel for refined products, rather than the crude oil price cap. And also from a volume perspective, there is a much higher volume of product that's being moved on crude oil ships. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because I think what's going on with fossil fuels is absolutely fascinating and also completely critical in terms of the Russian economy. As I said right at the start of today's video, Russia has built its wealth on the sale of oil and gas historically. And one of the major impacts of the invasion of Ukraine has been the fact that its single biggest buyer, Europe, which is on the doorstep of Russia, has turned its back on those sales. And that's been a major disaster from Russia's point of view. Firstly, from the natural gas point of view, because Russia spent 30 or 40 years constructing pipelines at huge expense so that it could provide all of that gas directly to countries like Germany and Italy. And once those pipelines were built, Russia literally just sat back and watched the cash come rolling in. And as we saw in January 2022, natural gas sales were actually the largest form of income that Russia was earning. But unfortunately, most of those sales have gone up in flames. They've disappeared. In fact, quite literally, when we talk about the Nord Stream pipelines that were providing Germany, that pipeline was blown up. We still don't have a categorical answer as to who was behind that explosion, whether it was the West or Russia or somebody else, we don't really know. But the bottom line is that pipeline is no longer operational, and even if it was, Germany wouldn't be buying any gas anyway, because from a political point of view, it doesn't want to. So over the past 2 years or so, Russia has seen a fall of around 80% in natural gas revenues. And it's also seen a dramatic fall in liquefied natural gas sales because it's lost its customers and it's also lost its business partners, the companies that help them build those facilities. And there are now question marks as to whether or not Russia has access to the right technology to keep those facilities going. But in addition to the lost gas sales, Russia has also lost a huge amount of sales from refined oil products because these are the most expensive products that you can buy. They've been through the refinery process and so they cost top dollar. And as a result of that, India and China simply don't want to buy them. They would rather buy crude oil and make those refined products themselves. Now, interestingly, crude oil sales have been maintained at roughly speaking the same level as where Russia was before the war started. And the way that Russia has managed to do that is by moving 75% of that oil using ships that are not owned or insured by the West. And that's a complete reversal of the situation back in 2022, when Russia was using around 75% of those ships. Now, Russia is using what's called a dark tanker fleet. So many of these tankers are old, they're out of commission, they would be put to scrapyards in the West. However, they're still being operated by other countries. And there is now a risk that we could get an ecological disaster particularly because a lot of these ships are turning their transponders off, which is technically illegal when they're moving all of that product. But unfortunately, from Russia's point of view, the West is now laser focused on closing down on the use of these dark tankers. It sees this as the last loophole in terms of the sanctions, because if Russia doesn't have access to that dark tanker fleet, it will be forced to use the ships that are owned and insured by the West, and if it does so, then the price caps will be applied to that oil. At the moment, the dark tankers can sell that oil at any price they like because nobody is checking up on any of the documentation. So the overall summary of today's video is that the sanctions that have been introduced against Russia have had a devastating impact on Russia's income. It's gone down from around $1 billion per day back in the start of 2022 to around $660 today. That represents a fall of almost $125 billion of revenue per year. And that is a huge amount of money. And when you consider the amount that Russia is investing into the war in Ukraine has increased by around 50% over the past 12 months, we've got a situation where Russia's income is declining and its expenditure is going up. And the way that Russia is funding that is through its reserves. And if Russia carries on in this situation, it's likely that those reserves will run out at some point over the course of the next 6 to 12 to 18 months. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video, you found it useful, informative and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end, and here's something to put a smile on your face.